Section 12 of T. DeWitt Talmage as I Knew Him. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jeff Moon of Rochester, New York. T. DeWitt Talmage as I Knew Him by Thomas DeWitt Talmage. Milestone 7, Part 2. Every now and then, for many years, there was an investigation of some sort in Brooklyn. Our bridge was a favorite target of investigation.
"Where has the money for this great enterprise been expended?"
was the common question. I defended the trustees because people did not realize the emergencies that arose as the work progressed and entailed greater expenditures. Originally, when projected, it was to cost $7 million, but there was to be only one wagon road. It was resolved later to enlarge the structure and build 2 wagon roads and a place for trains, freight, and passenger cars. Those enlarged plans were all to the ultimate advantage of the growth of Brooklyn. It was at first intended to make the approaches of the bridge in trestle work. Then plans were changed and they were built of granite. The cable, which was originally to be made of iron, was changed to steel. For 3 years, these cables were the line on which the passengers on ferryboats hung their jokes about swindling and political bribery. No investigation was able to shake my respect for the integrity of Mr. Stranahan, one of the bridge trustees. He did as much for Brooklyn as any man in it. He was the promoter of Prospect Park, designed and planned from his head and his heart. With all the powers at my disposal, I defended the bridge trustee. There was an attempt in New York toward the close of 1882 to present the Passion Play on the stage of a theater. A license was applied for. The artist, no matter how high his profession, who would dare to appear in the character of the divine person, was fit only for the Tombs prison or Sing Sing. I had no objection to any man attempting the role of Judas Iscariot. That was entirely within the limitations of stage art. Seth Low was mayor of Brooklyn, and Mr. Grace was mayor of New York, a Protestant and a Catholic, and yet they were of one opinion on this proposed blasphemy. I think everyone in America realized that the Democratic victory in the election of Grover Cleveland by a majority of 190,000 votes as governor of New York was a presidential prophecy. The contest for president came up seriously in the spring of 1883, and the same headlines appeared in the political caucus. Among the candidates was Benjamin F. Butler, governor of Massachusetts. I believed then that there was not a better man in the United States for president than Chester A. Arthur. I believed that his faithfulness and dignity in office should be honored with the nomination. There was some surprise occasioned when Harvard refused to confer an LL.D. on Governor Butler, a rebuke that no previous governor of Massachusetts had suffered. After all, the country was chiefly impressed in this event with the fact that an LL.D. or D.D. or an F.R.S. did not make the man. Americans were becoming very good readers of character. They could see at a glance the difference between right and wrong, but they were tolerant of both. Much more so than I was. There was one great fault in American character that the whole world admired. It was our love of hero worship. A great man was the man who did great things, no matter what that man might stand for in religion or in morals. There was Gambetta, whose friendship for America had won the admiration of our country. I myself admired his eloquence, his patriotism, his courage in office as Prime Minister of France, but his dying words rolled like a wintry sea over all nations. I am lost. Gambetta was an atheist, a man whose public indignities to womanhood were demonstrated from Paris to Berlin. Gambetta's patriotism for France could never atone for his atheism and his infamy towards women. His death in the dawn of 1883 was a page in the world's history turned down at the corner. What an important year it was to be for us. In the spring of 1883, the Brooklyn Bridge was opened, and our church was within 15 or 20 minutes of the hotel center of New York. I said then that many of us would see the population of Brooklyn quadrupled and sextupled. In many respects, up to this time, Brooklyn had been treated as a suburb of New York, a dormitory for tired Wall Streeters. With the completion of the bridge came new plans for rapid transit, for the widening of our streets, for the advancement of our municipal interests. A consolidation of Brooklyn and New York was then under discussion. It was a bad lookout for office holders, but a good one for taxpayers. At least that was the prospect, but I will never see much encouragement in American politics. The success of Grover Cleveland and his big majority as governor led both wings of the Democratic Party to promise us the millennium. Even the Republicans were full of national optimism, going over to the Democrats to help the Jubilee of Reform. 4 months later, although we were told that Mr. Cleveland was to be president, he could not get his own legislature to ratify his nomination. His hands were tied, and his idolaters were only waiting for his term of office to expire. The politicians lied about him. Because as governor of New York he could not give all of the office seekers places, he was, in a few months, executed by his political friends, and the millennium was postponed that politics might have time to find someone else to be lifted up, and in turn hurled into oblivion. That the politics of our country might serve a wider purpose, a great agitation among the newspapers began. The price of the great dailies came down from 4 to 3 cents, and from 3 to 2 cents. In a week it looked as though they would all be down to 1 cent. I expected to see them delivered free, with a bonus given for the favor of taking them at all. It was not a pleasant outlook, this deluge of printed matter, cheapened in every way, by cheaper labor, cheaper substance, and cheaper grammar. It was a plan that enlarged the scope of influence over what was arrogantly claimed as editorial territory, public opinion. Public opinion is sound enough, so long as it is not taken too seriously in the newspapers. The difference between a man as his antagonists depict him and as he really is in his own character may be as wide as the ocean. I was particularly impressed with this fact when I met the Reverend Dr. Ewer of New York, who had been accused of being disputatious and arrogant. Truth was, he was a master in the art of religious defense, wielding a scimitar of sharp edge. I never met a man with more of the childlike, the affable, and the self-sacrificing qualities that Dr. Ewer had. He was an honest man in the highest sense, with a never-varying purity of purpose. Dr. Ewer died in the fall of 1883. I began to feel that in the local management of our own big city there was an uplift, when two such sterling young men as James W. Ridgway and Joseph C. Hendricks were nominated for district attorney. They were merely technical opponents, but were united in the cause of reform and honest administration against our criminal population. We were fortunate in the degree of promise there was in having a choice of such competent nominees. But it was a period of historical jubilee in our country, this fall of 1883. We were celebrating centennials everywhere, even at Harvard. It seemed to be about 100 years back since anything worthwhile had really happened in America. Since 1870 there had been a round of centennials. It was a good thing in the busy glorification of a brilliant present and a glorious future that we rehearsed the struggle and hardships by which we had arrived to this great inheritance of blessing and prosperity. "The United States government is a bubble-bursting nationality," said Lord John Russell, but every year since has disproved the accuracy of this jeer. Even our elections disproved it. Candidates for the presidency are pushed out of sight by a sudden wave of split tickets. In the elections of 1883, in Ohio 10 candidates were obliterated. In Pennsylvania 5 were buried and 15 resurrected. In Indiana, the record of names in United States political quicksands is too long to consider, the new candidates that sprang up being still larger in numbers. And yet only 6 men in any generation become president. Out of 5,000 men who consider themselves competent to be captains, only 6 are crowned with their ambition. And convention, failing on the 30th ballot to get the nomination, some less conspicuous man is chosen as a compromise. Political ambition seems to me a poor business. There are men more worthy of national praise than the successful politicians, men like Isaac Hull, men whose generous gifts and Christian careers perpetuate the magnificent purposes of our lives. Isaac Hull was a Quaker, one of the best in that sect. I lived among Quakers for 7 years in Philadelphia, and I loved them. Mr. Hull illustrated in his life the principles of his sect, characterized by the integrity of finance and of soul. He rose to the front rank of public-spirited men from the humble duties of a farmer's boy. He was one of the most important members of the Society of Friends, and I valued the privilege of his friendship more than that of any celebrity I ever knew. He lived for the profit in standards rather than for wealth, and he passed on to a wider circle of friends beyond. I have a little list of men who about this time passed away amid many antagonisms, men who were misunderstood while they lived. I knew their worth. There was John McKean, the district attorney of New York, who died in 1883, when criticism against him of lawyers and judges was most bitter and cruel. A brilliant lawyer, he was accused of non-performance of duty, but he died knowing nothing of the delays complained of. He was blamed for what he could not help. Some stroke of ill health, Some untoward worldly circumstances or something in domestic conditions will often disqualify a man for service, and yet he is blamed for idleness, for having possessions when the finances are cramped, for temper when the nerves have given out, for misanthropy when he has had enough to disgust him forever with the human race. After we have exhausted the vocabulary of our abuse, such men die, and there is no reparation we can make. In spite of the abuse John McKean received, the courts adjourned in honor of his death. But that was a belated honor. McKean was one of the kindest of men. He was merciful and brave. There was Henry Villard, whose bankruptcy of fortune killed him. He was compelled to resign the presidency of the Northern Pacific Railroad Company, to resign his fortune, to resign all but his integrity. That he kept, though every dollar had gone. Only 2 years before his financial collapse, he was worth $30 million. In putting the Great Northern Pacific Railroad through, he swamped everything he had. All through Minnesota and the Northwest I heard his praises. He was a man of great heart and unbounded generosity, on which fed innumerable human leeches, enough of them to drain the life of any fortune that was ever made. On a magnificent train he once took, free of charge, to the Yellowstone Park a party of men who denounced him because, while he provided them with every luxury, they could not each have a separate drawing-room car to themselves. I don't believe since the world began there went through this century so many titled non-entities as traveled then, free of cost, on the generous bounty of Mr. Villard. The most of these people went home to the other side of the sea and wrote magazine articles on the condition of American society, while Mr. Villard went into bankruptcy. It was the last straw that broke the camel's back. It would not be so bad if riches only had wings with which to fly away, but they have claws with which they give a parting clutch that sometimes clips a man's reason or crushes his heart. It is the claw of riches we must look out for. Then there was Wendell Phillips. Not a man in this country was more admired and more hated than he was. Many a time, addressing a big audience, he would divide them into two parts, those who got up to leave with indignation and those who remained to frown. He was often, during a lecture, bombarded with bricks and bad eggs. But he liked it. He could endure anything in an audience but silence, and he always had a secure following of admirers. He told me once that in some of the back-country towns of Pennsylvania it nearly killed him to lecture. "I go on for an hour," he told me, "without hearing one response, and I have no way of knowing whether the people are instructed, pleased, or outraged." He enjoyed the tempestuous life. His other life was home. It was dominant in his appreciation. He owed much of his courage to that home. Lecturing in Boston once, during most agitated times, he received this note from his wife: "No shilly-shallying, Wendell, in the presence of this great public outrage." Many men in public life owe their strength to this reservoir of power at home. The last 15 years of his life were devoted to the domestic invalidism of his home. Some men thought this was unjustifiable, but what exhaustion of home life had been given to establish his public career. A popular subscription was started to raise a monument in Boston to Wendell Phillips. I recommended that it should be built within sight of the monument erected to Daniel Webster. If ever there were two men who during their life had an appalling antagonism, they were Daniel Webster and Wendell Phillips. I hoped at that time their statues would be erected facing each other. Wendell Phillips was fortunate in his domestic tower of strength. Still, I have known men whose domestic lives were painful in the extreme, and yet they rose above this deficiency to great personal prominence. What is good for one man is not good for another. It is the same with states' rights as it is with private rights. In '83 to '84, the whole country was agitated about the questions of tariff reform and free trade. Tariff reform for Pennsylvania, free trade for Kentucky, New England, and the Northwest had interests that would always be divergent. It was absurd to try to persuade the American people that what was good for one state was good for another state. Common intelligence showed how false that theory was. Until by some great change the manufacturing interests of the country should become national interests, cooperation and compromise in interstate commerce was necessary. No one section of the country could have its own way. The most successful candidate for the presidency at this time seemed to be the man who could most bewilder the public mind on these questions. Blessed in politics is the political fog. The most significantly hopeful fact to me was that the three prominent candidates for speakership at the close of 1883, Mr. Carlyle, Mr. Randall, and Mr. Cox, never had wine on their tables. We were, moreover, getting away from the old order of things, when senators were conspicuous in gambling houses. The world was advancing in a spiritual transit of events toward the close. It was time that it gave way to something even better. It had treated me gloriously, and I had no fault to find with it, but I had seen so many millions in hunger and pain and wretchedness and woe that I felt this world needed either to be fixed up or destroyed. The world had had a hard time for 6,000 years, and as the new year of 1884 approached, there were indications that our planet was getting restless. There were earthquakes, great storms, great drought. It may last until some of my descendants shall head their letters with January 1st, 15,000 A.D., but I doubt it. End of section 12.